The porcelain shattered against the flagstones before anyone could stop it, and for a moment nobody in that vast dining hall breathed at all. Eleanor stood frozen, with the tray still tilted in her hands, wine soaking dark into the hem of her grey serving dress, and 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her like a single accusing creature. "Clumsy girl," her stepmother said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, loud enough for the servants pressed against the walls to hear, loud enough for the guest of honor himself to hear. "This is why she belongs in the kitchen and not at my table." Laughter rippled down the length of the linen-draped table, cruel and bright, and Eleanor bent to gather the broken shards with hands that did not shake, though everything inside her did. What happened at that banquet would end one family's reign of cruelty and begin another woman's rise to a place none of them ever imagined. And if you want to see exactly how far this story goes, make sure you are subscribed. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Whitmore had still worn her mother's wedding ring on a chain beneath her collar and still believed, in the quiet, stubborn way of the young, that kindness returned in kind. Her father had been a respected physician in the county, a man of modest fortune and considerable warmth, and when he married the widow, Margaret Ashford, 2 years after Eleanor's mother died of a fever, Eleanor had welcomed her stepmother and her 2 stepdaughters, Constance and Julia, with the open hope of a girl who had lost too much already and wanted, more than anything, a family whole again. For a season it seemed she might have it. Margaret was attentive in company, solicitous in front of Eleanor's father, careful to arrange her cruelties for moments when he could not see them. It was only after the physician's heart failed him one autumn morning at his writing desk, pen still in hand, that Margaret let the mask drop entirely, and the house that had once been Eleanor's father's became, in every practical sense, a prison with good furniture. The will had left the estate nominally to Eleanor, but Margaret controlled the accounts, the staff, the correspondence, and within a year had manoeuvred the household so thoroughly that Eleanor owned everything and possessed nothing. She was moved from the blue bedroom that had been hers since childhood into a narrow servant's room above the kitchens. Her fine dresses were given to Constance, who was near enough her size, with the excuse that Eleanor had no need of finery now, that she helped run the household. Helped run the household was Margaret's phrase for it, spoken sweetly to visitors, though what it meant in practice was that Eleanor rose before dawn to light the fires, oversaw the laundry, mended linens until her fingers bled at the tips, and on evenings when Margaret entertained, served at table alongside the hired staff while Constance and Julia sat among the guests in gowns that had once hung in Eleanor's own wardrobe. She endured it, the way she had learned to endure everything since her father's death, with a silence that unsettled people more than tears would have. Constance called her plain and dull to guests who had not asked. Julia, younger and crueler for being newer to her own power, liked to spill things near Eleanor on purpose so she would have to kneel and clean it up in front of company, and once at a spring garden party had upended an entire pitcher of lemonade over Eleanor's only good pair of shoes. Margaret's particular gift for cruelty was subtler and more devastating for it. A comment about Eleanor's complexion dropped into conversation as though it were sympathy, a remark to a prospective suitor's mother that Eleanor was sadly not the marrying kind, delivered with a sorrowful little sigh that made the insult sound like tenderness. Eleanor absorbed all of it. She learned, the way some people learn a language out of necessity, to keep her face still no matter what was said in front of her, because she had noticed early that giving Margaret the satisfaction of a reaction only sharpened the next blow. What none of them ever saw, because none of them ever thought to look, was who Eleanor was when there was no one to perform cruelty for. It was Eleanor who sat up 2 full nights nursing the under-housemaid Sally through a fever that the family physician they'd hired had pronounced hopeless, spooning broth between the girl's cracked lips until the fever broke at dawn. It was Eleanor who, finding the stable boy Tom weeping behind the coach house because his mother in the village could not afford the winter's coal, emptied the small tin box where she hid the few coins she'd managed to save from selling her mother's old lace. It was Eleanor who read aloud to old Mrs. Pruitt, half-blind and forgotten in the cook's quarters, every Sunday afternoon that she could steal away. Not because anyone would reward her for it, not because anyone would even know, but because it seemed to her the only decent way to spend an hour that was technically her own. Sally never forgot it. Tom never forgot it. Mrs. Scott, say. Pruitt, who missed very little despite her failing eyes, watched the girl, who was treated like nothing, give away everything she had, and she began, quietly, to say prayers for her at night that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. It was into this house, the golden last days of that autumn, that the Duke of Ashworth came, though no one in Margaret's drawing-room yet knew what he was. He arrived under the name Edmund Grey, a wealthy gentleman of business newly come into the county to look at land, and the story of how he came to Margaret's table at all was a small vanity on Margaret's part that would prove in time to be her undoing. She had heard, through the gossip that travelled county society faster than any letter could, that a Mr. Grey of considerable and mysterious fortune had taken rooms at the coaching inn in the village, and she had contrived, through a mutual acquaintance and a great deal of transparent manoeuvring, to have him invited to dine at her table alongside a dozen other guests she hoped to impress. She did not know, could not have known, that Edmund Grey was in truth Edmund Ashworth, 9th Duke of that name, travelling under a plain man's title precisely because he had grown so weary of being courted for his rank. 5 years earlier he had been engaged to a woman who professed to love him desperately, only to discover, 2 weeks before the wedding, that she had been quietly negotiating a more advantageous match the entire time she smiled at him across breakfast tables and moonlit gardens. Since then he had made a private habit, whenever the opportunity arose, of moving through society unrecognized, watching how people behaved when they believed there was nothing in it for them, because he had learned the hard way that character shown to a duke and character shown to a nobody. He noticed her before he knew her name. It was a small thing, a servant girl in a grey dress crouched at the edge of the hall, speaking softly to a trembling old dog that had wandered in from the kitchen yard and lost its nerve among the boots and skirts of arriving guests, calming it with 2 words and a gentle hand. No one else at that party had so much as glanced at the dog. She had. He filed the moment away without remark and went in to dinner, and it was there not 20 minutes later that he watched the same girl carry a heavy tray the length of the table, watched a woman he would soon learn was the lady of the house announce to the assembled company that this girl was clumsy and belonged in the kitchen. Watched the girl's face go carefully, deliberately still, the way a person's face goes still when they have had a great deal of practice hiding pain. Something in him, some old bruise of his own, recognized something in her, and he found he could not look away from her for the rest of the evening, no matter how determinedly Constance angled herself into his line of sight. The dinner that followed was, on its surface, an ordinary provincial gathering, full of the small vanities and petty competitions that filled every drawing-room in the county. But underneath it, Edmund watched a performance so precise it might have been staged. Margaret steered every conversation toward her daughter's accomplishments, Constance's skill at the pianoforte, Julia's supposed gift for languages, mentioning almost as an afterthought, whenever Eleanor passed near enough to overhear, some small cruelty disguised as candor, that Eleanor preferred the company of servants to that of her betters, that it was really quite remarkable how little the girl seemed to mind her position, as though minding it were a mark of good breeding she simply lacked. Eleanor said nothing to any of it. She refilled glasses, she cleared plates, she moved through the room like a ghost that everyone had agreed not to see, and twice Edmund caught her steadying a trembling hand against the sideboard for just a moment before she composed herself and carried on, and, both times, something in his chest tightened in a way he did not examine too closely. It was Julia, near the end of the meal, who provided the evening's cruelest entertainment. She had noticed the Duke's attention wandering, she did not know where, only that it was not fixed on her, and in the particular jealousy of a girl unused to being outshone by anyone, let alone a stepsister in a servant's apron, she called across the table for Eleanor to sing, knowing perfectly well that grief had closed something in her throat that no amount of practice could reopen. "Go on, Eleanor," Julia said, sweet as poison. "Sing something for our guests, won't you? Or has the kitchen made you forget how?" The table laughed again, and Eleanor, tray still in her hands, said only that she was afraid she had no voice for it tonight, and set down the tray and left the room with a composure that cost her more than any of them would ever know, and it was Edmund, watching her go, who felt for the first time that evening something harder than pity settle into his expression, something closer to resolve. He found her 20 minutes later in the small walled garden behind the kitchens, where she had gone to breathe air that did not smell of wine and perfume and other people's contempt. She did not hear him approach until he was nearly beside her, and when she turned and saw who it was, she startled and began at once to apologize, to explain that she had only stepped out for a moment, that she would return to her duties directly, the reflexive apology of someone who has learned that her mere presence requires justification. He told her gently that she owed him no apology at all, and asked, because he found he genuinely wanted to know, and not merely to make conversation, what had made her leave the room. She was quiet for a long moment, and then, perhaps because he was a stranger, and strangers are sometimes easier to be honest with than family, she told him the truth, that she used to sing, that her father had loved to hear her sing, that she had not been able to since he died, and that being asked to perform grief for an audience that wanted only her humiliation was more than she could bear tonight. Edmund said nothing clever in response. He simply said that grief was not a performance owed to anyone, and that whoever had asked it of her as one had shown a smallness of character that had nothing to do with her. It was such a small kindness, 3 plain sentences spoken in a dark garden, but Eleanor would remember them for the rest of her life as the first time in 3 years that anyone had looked at her pain and called it simply real. He came back to the county twice more, in the following weeks ostensibly to view land, and both times contrived, with the ease of a man used to getting what he wanted, though he was careful never to let his wanting show too plainly, to encounter Eleanor away from the house. He found her once reading to Mrs. Pruitt in the cook's small quarters, her voice patient and warm in a way it never was in Margaret's drawing-room, and stood unseen in the doorway for several minutes rather than interrupt. He found her once tending a bird with a broken wing that she had wrapped in a strip torn from her own petticoat, working with a tenderness that made him think, unbidden, of his own mother, dead now 11 years, who had kept a whole menagerie of injured creatures on the ducal estate, and taught him that how a person treated the powerless told you everything you needed to know about how they would treat the powerful once they had the chance. Each small scene confirmed what he had begun to suspect the first night in Margaret's dining room, that Eleanor Whitmore was, without ornament or performance, the most genuinely good person he had encountered in a very long time, and that the family who owned her labor had no idea what they possessed and would have despised it. Margaret, for her part, had begun to notice Mr. Gray's visits, and, being a woman who understood advantage the way a hawk understands wind, drew entirely the wrong conclusion from them. She assumed, with the confidence of someone who has never once considered, that the servant in the room might be the point of interest rather than the furniture, that a man of Mr. Gray's evident fortune could only be calling on her account, or failing that, on one of her daughters, and she began at once to angle Constance into every path he might cross, and to speak of Julia's accomplishments at every opportunity, entirely blind to the fact that Edmund's true reason for returning walked past her 3 times a day in a grey servant's dress, carrying trays she did not think anyone truly saw. It was Constance who first grew suspicious that something was wrong with the arithmetic of the situation, watching Mr. Gray's eyes track a shape across the drawing-room that was never her own, and it was Constance who, one evening in the corridor outside her mother's sitting-room, thinking herself unheard, hissed to Julia that something had to be done about Eleanor before she made a fool of them all somehow, and that some instinct told them the ground beneath their comfortable cruelty had begun, ever so slightly, to shift. Eleanor, passing the corridor with an armful of linens, heard enough of it to understand that she had become, however unwittingly, a target of a different order now, and something cold moved through her at the realization, though she said nothing, because saying nothing had always been the only safety she had. The final humiliation, the one that would prove to be Margaret's undoing, though she could not have known it at the time, came at the great autumn ball Margaret hosted 3 weeks later, an event she had been planning for months as the crowning social occasion of the season, an event to which half the county's notable families, Edmund Gray among them, had been invited. Margaret had decided, in a fit of spite, dressed up as practicality, that Eleanor would not attend as a guest at all, but would serve alongside the hired staff at the lavish supper laid out at midnight. On the grounds, spoken aloud to Eleanor, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that there were simply not enough gowns to go around, and someone sensible had to see to the arrangements. Eleanor did not argue. She had learned 3 years ago that arguing only sharpened Margaret's appetite for cruelty rather than dulling it, and so she spent the evening of the ball in a plain grey dress, hair pinned back without ornament, moving among candlelit tables laden with roasted meats and iced confections and crystal that caught the chandelier light like scattered stars, while Constance and Julia swept past in gowns of rose silk and pale blue satin, laughing with partners on the dance floor, and Margaret held court near the punch table, accepting compliments on an evening she had, in fact, largely allowed Eleanor to plan down to the last detail of the flowers. It was there, at the height of the evening, with the ballroom full and glittering, and every notable family in the county present to see it, that Edmund Gray did something no one in that room expected, least of all Margaret. He crossed the entire length of the ballroom, past Constance, who had positioned herself directly in his path with a hopeful smile, past Julia, who called his name in a voice pitched to carry, and stopped instead in front of Eleanor, who stood near the supper table with an empty serving tray still in her hands, and asked her, in a voice that did not bother to lower itself for discretion, whether she would do him the honour of sitting with him at supper. The room did not merely quiet. It stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. A footman near the door nearly dropped the tray of glasses he carried. Margaret's smile froze on her face, in the particular way of a person watching a carefully built structure begin, without warning, to crack. Eleanor herself stood utterly still, the tray trembling very slightly in her hands, certain for one long, terrible moment that she had misheard him, that this was some cruel joke orchestrated by Constance or Julia to humiliate her more thoroughly than they ever had before, because nothing in 3 years of this house had taught her to expect kindness offered this plainly, this publicly, by someone with nothing to gain from offering it. "Sir," she managed at last, a voice barely above a whisper, "I am only here to serve the supper." Edmund did not raise his voice, but he did not lower it either, and every word carried clearly across the hushed ballroom. "Then let it be served," he said, "while you sit beside me as my guest, because I did not come to this house tonight to dine with anyone else." Margaret recovered herself enough to step forward with a brittle laugh, already reaching for Eleanor's tray as though to physically remove her from the moment, already beginning some sentence about how kind Mr. Ayres. Gray was to notice the household staff, how Eleanor really must get back to her duties, how there were guests still to be served. And it was in that exact instant, with Margaret's hand closing around the tray and her mouth open on the beginning of another small cruelty, that the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and a footman in unfamiliar livery announced, in the formal, ringing tone reserved for occasions of genuine consequence, the arrival of His Grace the Duke of Ashworth's personal secretary, come to confirm arrangements for His Grace's stay in the county, and every head in the room turned first toward the doors, and then, in a slow-spreading wave of understanding, back toward the man standing beside Eleanor Whitmore, to have been cut by a far finer tailor than any of them had troubled to notice. The secretary crossed the room without hesitation, bowed deeply, not to Margaret, not to Constance, not to anyone seated at the tables of honor, but to the man in the plain coat standing beside the girl in grey, and addressed him, clearly and unmistakably, as Your Grace. The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely than the silence that had greeted the invitation to sit, a silence made of gasps, swallowed half-formed, of glasses lowered, without being set down, of Constance's hand flying to her mouth, and Julia going white as the tablecloth behind her, and Margaret's fingers going slack around the tray she had been about to seize, so that it tipped and nearly fell before Eleanor, out of pure instinct, built by 3 years of service, caught it without thinking. "Forgive the intrusion," the secretary said, straightening. "Your Grace's presence was requested this evening, under the name you have been using, but a matter regarding the Northern estate could not wait for morning." He held out a sealed letter, and Edmund took it without so much as glancing at the assembled company, his attention entirely fixed on Eleanor, whose face had gone through disbelief and confusion, and now settled slowly into a kind of stricken understanding, as though the last 3 months were rearranging themselves in her mind into an entirely different shape. "You are," she began, and could not finish the sentence, because there was no version of it that did not sound absurd, spoken aloud in a ballroom full of witnesses. "Edmund Ashworth," he said simply, as if it were the plainest fact in the world, and not the detonation of every social arrangement in that room. "Duke of Ashworth, I came into this county as Mr. Blank Grey because I have found over the years that people show you who they truly are far more honestly when they believe there is nothing to be gained by pretending otherwise." His gaze moved, deliberately, unhurriedly, from Eleanor's face to Margaret's, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees under the weight of that look. "I have dined at this table 3 times now. I have watched how this family speaks to the woman standing beside me, and I have watched how she conducts herself in return, and I confess I have rarely in my life seen a contrast so instructive." Margaret found her voice at last, thin and too high, already reaching for the practiced charm that had smoothed over every difficulty in her life until this one. "Your Grace, I'm sure there has been some misunderstanding, Eleanor is family. Of course we would never. The arrangements this evening were simply a matter of practicality, with so many guests to attend to. But the ballroom, 3 months of small cruelties suddenly visible in the harsh new light of who had been standing witness to them, and no amount of charm could unspill that particular pitcher of lemonade. "I have eyes, madam," Edmund said, and though his voice remained even, there was iron beneath it now that had not been there in the plain man's coat. "I watched you call this young woman clumsy in front of your assembled guests for an accident that was in fact no fault of hers. I set the tray off balance myself, reaching for a glass, and said nothing at the time because I wished to see how the matter would be handled. I have watched your younger daughter humiliate her deliberately on more than one occasion, and I have watched you require her to serve at her own family's table in a servant's dress, while women, with a fraction of her character, sat in silk and called themselves her betters." He turned to address not only Margaret now, but the room entire, every notable family present, every gossiping tongue that would carry this moment through the county for months to come. "I would have every person here understand precisely who has been treated as nothing in this household and precisely what she is worth." The crowd's reaction came all at once, a great collective exhale that broke the frozen silence into 100 separate whispers, a footman near the wall visibly straightening as though the very air of the room had changed, an elderly guest near the front murmuring something about having always thought it strange the way that family treated the eldest girl. Constance's carefully composed face crumbling into something closer to panic as she understood, in real time, exactly how thoroughly and publicly the ground had shifted beneath her family's feet. And Julia, younger and less practiced at concealment, beginning to cry openly, though whether from shame or fury it was impossible to say, made no difference at all. What followed happened with the swift formal efficiency of a man used to setting matters right once he had decided to. Edmund did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. He informed Margaret, in front of the assembled guests, that he had that afternoon completed a purchase he had been quietly arranging for some weeks, the deed to a small but comfortable property some miles distant, in Eleanor's name alone, drawn from land his own family had held for generations, gifted outright and without condition. So that whatever happened in that ballroom tonight, Eleanor Whitmore would never again spend a single day beneath a roof where her worth was decided by someone else's cruelty. He informed the room with the same even finality that he intended to make his interest in Miss Whitmore known formally and properly in the coming weeks, through her own choice and at her own pace, and that any family member who thought to obstruct that courtship, financially or otherwise, would find the Duke of Ashworth an exceedingly attentive and exceedingly unforgiving adversary. And he informed Margaret, last of all, in words that would be repeated in drawing-rooms across the county for the rest of the season, that a woman who had spent 3 years teaching her own household to despise kindness had, that night, taught a duke everything he needed to know about which of the women under her roof deserved to be called family. And it was not the two wearing silk. The weeks that followed unravelled Margaret's carefully constructed world with a speed that seemed, to those who had endured her superiority for years, almost providentially fast. The county families who had once vied for invitations to her table found sudden reasons to decline them. The matchmaking prospects Margaret had been cultivating for Constance and Julia evaporated overnight. No family of standing willing to attach itself to daughters whose treatment of a stepsister had been laid bare in front of a duke and half the county's notable houses. The modest fortune Margaret had so carefully controlled proved on closer legal examination, prompted by Edmund's own solicitors, to have been managed with a looseness bordering on impropriety, siphoned in small increments toward Constance's and Julia's dowries at the expense of an estate, and within 2 months Margaret found herself facing the loss of the house entirely, forced to remove to smaller rented rooms in a part of the county considerably less inclined to receive her. Constance, whose beauty had been her only currency, and whose currency had just been publicly devalued, married eventually and without much ceremony a widowed solicitor 20 years her senior, who wanted a housekeeper more than a wife, and Julia, still young enough to learn better and perhaps the only one of the three who ever truly did, went to live with a distant aunt in the north who was, by all reports, considerably less patient with cruelty than her mother had ever been, and who set about teaching Julia, slowly and without gentleness, precisely the lessons her upbringing had failed to provide. Eleanor did not gloat. It was not in her nature, and those who knew her, Sally, who wept with joy the day she learned of it, Tom, who could not stop grinning for a week, old Mrs. Jew, Pruitt, who declared she had known all along, in the manner of the very old, that goodness kept in the dark eventually finds its own light, understood that her restraint was not weakness, but the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 3 years of humiliation, with her character entirely intact. She accepted the property Edmund had given her, not as a gift from a suitor, but as simple justice restored, and she moved into it that autumn with Sally at her side, having offered the girl a position as companion and dear friend rather than servant. Pruitt installed in the sunniest room of the house, where she could sit by the window and be read to whenever she liked, by choice now, rather than stolen hours. Edmund courted her properly through that winter, with none of the urgency that had marked the ballroom's revelation, calling on her openly, walking with her through gardens that were now entirely her own, asking her opinion on matters of business and land management, with the genuine interest of a man who had learned, in the hardest possible way, the difference between a woman who wanted his title and a woman who had never once known, until the night he was unmasked, that he had one at all. They married the following spring, in a ceremony, neither large nor small, attended by the people who had actually earned a place in Eleanor's life, rather than the ones who had once claimed a place by right of blood. Sally standing as her closest attendant, Tom driving the carriage with a pride he could not contain, old Mrs. Scren, Pruitt seated in the front pew in the finest shawl Eleanor could find for her, weeping happily through the entire service. Margaret was not invited, and did not ask to be. Constance sent a stiff and belated letter of congratulations some months later, that Eleanor answered with the same quiet grace she had answered every cruelty of her old life, polite, brief, and entirely without malice, because she had decided, somewhere in that long walk from servant's tray to duchess's title, that she would not let bitterness take up the space in her heart that kindness had spent 3 years defending. Years later, when their own daughter was old enough to ask why her mother always insisted on speaking kindly to every servant in the house, why she knelt to greet the youngest kitchen maid by name, why she never once in all the great halls and grand occasions of her new life let anyone at her table go unseen the way she once had been, Eleanor would tell her simply that she had once believed her worth was decided by the people who set the tables, until a man who owned a dozen tables of his own showed her that it never had been, not for a single day, and that the truest measure of anyone, duke or scullery maid, was not the seat they were given, but the grace with which they treated everyone who had none at all.